Hello, everyone. Let's learn about materials and resources and their connection to sustainable design. We'll start out with a broad overview of what are materials and resources, abbreviated MR, and their importance to the field of sustainable design, and then dig deeper into individual strategies for materials and resources. And those can be grouped in three categories: conservation of materials, preferable materials, and waste management and/or reduction. Finally, we'll touch on the topic of materials and resources through the project life cycle. So let's start out thinking about this topic and realize that setting goals for using sustainable materials and resources is going to be an important step of the green building process. And in fact, it's one of the first important steps. And overall, this is because materials are the foundation of the buildings. All right. Um, and so we need to consider the embodied environmental impact, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. All right. And the different costs that are involved with those materials, including extraction, production, transportation, consumption, and disposal. In the beginning of the semester, we started out thinking about reduce, reuse, recycle. All right. But that is only just the beginning. And it turns out that we really need to think about the selection of our materials as well as this old aphorism. Another tool that you learned about several weeks ago was the idea of life cycle thinking. Now, we applied this to the building as a whole and the individual systems involved, but it turns out that life cycle thinking is an important tool for thinking about materials and resources. And this idea can help your team, your integrated design team, make informed decisions about materials. You can evaluate the best options and you can weigh the trade-offs associated with each material selection. Let's also connect the use of materials and resources to the triple bottom line. And it turns out there are a number of benefits and synergies that you can achieve with the correct or informed selection of materials. Starting with people, all right, you can select materials to reduce toxins in the people's environment, therefore increasing their health and well-being. And then this is an interesting one, and it has to do with the selection of local materials. By doing so, you can increase the cultural and contextual relevancy of their surroundings. Moving on to some benefits for the planet. These ones are easier to understand by careful selection of materials and resources. You can reduce the embodied energy in your materials. You can reduce pollutants and toxins in the material, excuse me, in the environment. And you can also reduce the transportation impact of the materials that you select. Moving to the category of profits, in general, we're interested in keeping costs down. And one of the ways to do that is to simply reduce the total amount of materials purchased or procured, and also reduce construction waste or reduce waste in general, so we're not paying for things that you don't use. LEED has a materials and resources credit category. And overall, its overall goal is to minimize the impact associated with building materials across their entire life cycle. And to do so, it's going to address the following three issues. So we're going to take a closer look at them. And that is conservation of materials, environmentally preferable materials, and waste management and reduction. So let's start out by talking about conservation of materials. And this one applies to the reduce part of reduce, reuse, recycle. All All right. And the overall idea is that reducing the total amount of material in a structure, all right, is a good thing. All right. And you'll use less materials. Okay. And so you can do this by building more efficiently, by designing to use materials more efficiently, or simply making smaller buildings. And here's a vocabulary word for you. The reduction in materials, the decrease in materials usage, is known as dematerialization. And there's a couple of common ways to do this, or maybe some you think about them as design tools or strategies. One of them is prefabrication and modular construction. And this enables you to use materials more efficiently as the systems are built in a factory or a shop, all right, and transported to the site. All right, you end up with a lot of efficient practices when you're able to do that. And advanced framing is the next tool that is commonly used to reduce materials usage. And this is a framing method that carefully details the frame in general to reduce the number of, to reduce the wood usage, the number of studs, etc. In general, here are some strategies for conservation of materials. And the first and biggest one is to reuse existing buildings. All right. Adaptive reuse of entire buildings is a powerful tool here. Or you can also reuse salvaged materials. Again, with the idea that you keep your construction to a minimum, you can plan for smaller and more compact communities and design smaller homes and buildings. This goes along with the idea of flexibility of use, all right? And will, in general, you try to provide multiple functions using the same space. The next one we just touched on, and that's using efficient framing techniques to use less construction materials in general. And finally, to promote source reduction in operations. And this is, they're talking about the operation of the building after it's been constructed. We'll pause here. In our discussion of materials and resources, we've been talking about the different strategies that are appropriate for this category, and we just talked about conservation of materials. Thanks, everyone.